So Mark,
Cool.
over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, guys. As Simon said, I'm sure probably very few people are aware of possibly even where Bangladesh is, certainly as a country, what it does. Most people have skipped over it. It's actually next to India, just under China. But what I can safely say is that BProperty, and you'll hear why, we are the only property solution provider in the entire country. And what I mean by that is, frankly, the only one with a portal, the only one, the formalized real estate agent, and now how we're leveraging that position, the information we have, the processes we have, to now start to actually infiltrate and work with other industries that are attached to property in order to create more value. But just giving a bit of a summary of Bangladesh today. Probably very few people would actually appreciate that in the last 5 years, Bangladesh in the region itself is one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing country in terms of GDP growth. It's far outweighed anything from China, India, etc. So over the last 5 years in particular, it's had circa 7%, 8% GDP growth. That's very much fueled by FMCG, but also its salary base or its cost of labor compared with what's developed in India, what's developed in China, etc., is much lower. And so what that's done is it started to push other organizations, other industries to develop businesses in Bangladesh in order to just get access to that cheap labor. In terms of the country itself, you can see on the right-hand side, it's about 160, 170 million people. But what you can also see, it's a very, very growing age bracket around about a 25 to 35. So these guys here grew up with very little, but actually in the last 5, 10 years with that GDP growth, their wages and inflation on wages is growing to the extent now that their level of disposable income is much greater than actually what their parents had. And what that's doing is it's actually now changing the social habits of consumers, both from obviously real estate, which is where I come from, but also how they interact with things like food delivery. They don't eat at home anymore, they don't cook at home, they're living outside of the home a lot more than traditionally their parents would. Now, what impact does this actually have and what's it had on the real estate sector itself? So to give you a bit of a background, there is an undersupply of housing in the country. So in Dhaka alone, which some people would say is probably the most densely populated city in the world, geographically it's 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers, but about circa anything between 25 and 35 million people live in it. And there's a scarcity of land and there is a shortage of housing with regards to this city. So what's actually happening is these social changes is actually placing a heck of a lot of pressure on housing itself. Why? Historically, 3 generations used to live in the same property. So if I was a kid, I would ordinarily just expect that the home that I was born in is the home that I'm going to die in. The home that I'm going to own or buy at some point in time is going to effectively be transferred to me by my parents when obviously they pass. But now with accessibility to money, secondly with different social changes, with that younger generation not really wanting to live with mum and dad anymore, it's placing a heck of a lot more pressure around the real estate industry in particular because they don't want to live with mum and dad. They want to grow there, or they don't want to start their family with mum and dad, grandparents in the same house or same apartment. They see a lot of other property options in here, Bangkok, KL, Singapore, etc., innovative housing solutions, and that's placing a lot of pressure on the housing sector itself. And the current rate of development of new housing is insufficient. So at the moment, only about 10,000 homes, new builds, are being launched every single year. That's a deficiency, in my opinion, based on developers. There's very few foreign developers there. And that deficiency is largely built through inefficient developers. Typically takes about 4 to 5 years to build a 10-story apartment building. So it's very, very inefficient. And so this new supply actually is, the rate of, the shortage of homes, should I say, is growing because there's not enough housing coming onto the market. So what's actually happened then is that because of those factors that I just talked about, the secondary market has started to be created. But that, over the last, say, 10, 15 years, there was actually nowhere to transact to find a property. And so what would ordinarily happen is a user, if they wanted to go and find a property, they would literally go door to door themselves. They get a rickshaw, they would go old school in the streets, and you'd have a for sale or for rent outside the building, and then they would just door knock. And you would just go through this process very, very repeatedly. There was also no structured mechanism for transferring of properties. We estimate that 50% of all properties in, I can speak about Dhaka, has a documentation problem. What I mean by documentation problem is there's missing documents, there's fraudulent documents, property hasn't been transacted correctly previously, and that creates a lot of challenges for consumers to have to navigate. But what you can see on the right-hand side there is, over time, just the number of secondary listings that have appeared on our portal. That's probably over the last maybe 3-4 years. And that's just being driven by, largely, in my opinion, BProperty offering now a solution to formalize what this entire real estate sector actually, and how it operates. So let me just talk now on BProperty's market leadership, and it's probably best to understand how our journey is. So the portal was actually launched in 2016. So for those that don't know, BProperty was actually launched through EMPG. It was the third portal through EMPG. I've worked with them since 2016. And why Bangladesh? Honestly, it's because of the factors I talked about before. It was 170 million people, very, very fragmented player. Lamudi were there, but really weren't doing too much. There was a horizontal in Bikroy that had nothing on the property portal, and then there was nothing else. So, and actually what I would say is there's actually no real estate agent. And I'm going to touch on that in a minute. There is frankly no real estate agent in the entire country. We started monetization in 2017, and we went pure transactions. So our approach was, we're not going to get listing fees because the market doesn't operate that way. So we're going to go straight transactions. We opened up our first sales office 2018, launched in other cities 2019. I think just in Dhaka alone, we have 7 offices catering to the whole city. We launched mortgage solutions. We launched an interior solution, which leads us into property development. And then in the last, say, couple of months, we actually got acquired by DCG. And we'll be profitable. We're more or less there now, but certainly I think by April, we'll be profitable. And when I talk about market leadership, what I'm going to talk about here is market leadership from, frankly, every metric you can possibly deal with. So when we came into the market, there were no real estate agencies. So you ask yourself the question, where do you get your content from? And we could very easily, for those that know EMPG, typically you go straight developer sales. That's EMPG's approach. But the developers, just the economics of the projects in Bangladesh didn't cater itself to developer sales. So we went secondary, but with no real estate agents or agencies, where does the content come from? So we went by foot. So 2016, 2017, we actually had an operational team of circa about 100 that had an app that collected every single listing in the main 6-7 cities of the country. And over time, what that gives you is actually a very, very unique database that, frankly, even the government doesn't have with regards to what's going on within the actual property, the buildings, the projects itself. So today, we actually have over 500 people. We don't do any marketing. We get about 80,000 leads organically every single month. And we currently have, at the moment, 60,000 listings on the platform which are active. What I can show you there on the right-hand side is typically how a property was advertised previously. Old school, outside a house, on a tree, frankly anywhere you could hang a sign. That was basically how a property owner would rent out or sell their property. I'm going to come back to the operational side of things in shortly. But what we've also had here is very, very consistent growth. So this here is our metrics over the last probably 3-4 years. Typically, it's just focusing on buy rent. I'm not going to focus too much on what we do and how we monetize interior, construction, mortgage, legal, etc. But when we came into the market, the most we felt we could actually monetize was 2%. So the bottom left there says we started monetizing at 2%. Today, we're at about 5.5%. And my challenge to you guys in some of these markets is actually push the boundaries of what you think can actually be handled. Because at times I've faced over the last 5-6 years, we don't actually push anywhere near enough. And if you keep pushing in the market because there's no other solutions, it's surprising actually how much you can extract. A second point I'll talk around is cash. We actually get paid now before the property transfers. So we're getting paid our 5.5% before the property transfers because we take it in escrow, we take our fee now, and then we pass it on at the point of transfer, but it gives us that cash flow typically on day one. And that was a big learning of having to deal with leakage and a lot of these other challenges, previously. What you can see here is transaction trends, revenue growth. We tend to focus more on buy side, which is why rentals are a little bit more flattish over a longer period of time. But what I would say, and what I really wanted to touch on today was, for a portal like us, and I think a lot of portals probably in this room, the product and the operational process of how you get content for me is fundamental to what we do as a business. I used to run a business here in Thailand, and a lot of the portals here, there's so many duplicate listings. And the one thing that we don't have or we have in Bangladesh, which we didn't have in Thailand, was a complete, unique listing database, which gives us the ability to frame the market. So I know today that there are 190,000 projects in Dhaka. We know them by address, we know them by location. That gives us 2.3 million residential apartments, that gives us about 50,000 commercial properties. And every single one of these properties now has a unique reference and a unique address in our database. So what we do and what we started was we went around collecting this content every single month. And then over time, I think someone was talking about it earlier, you actually understand what shifts in the market. But getting access to that content, what we realized after a couple of years was if we can create a unique address, and addresses don't formally exist in Dhaka. If we can create a unique address per property, that now allows us to leverage the access to start to change other industries, finance being one, which I'll touch on shortly. So we created our unique database. Every listing or every property has a unique listing ID. That now tracks, that is a static listing, and we just build upon that data. We refresh that data every 25 days. So we still have that team that's in the market. It's smaller now than what it was, but we refresh that content or we add to it every 25 days. We have photos on basically every single property in those cities. We understand pricing, we understand yields, we know who's in them. We've got virtual tours, we've got videos. A lot of properties we actually have the legal documentation for. And this is an industry that the government actually does not even have this information digitally. And that now gives us the very, very distinct ability to now start to infiltrate and work with other industries. And so where we play today is, we've got these, what I would say, kind of 3 core focus areas or themes within the business. So today where we sit, we're sale and rent. We're moving into construction solutions. So we already do interior and redevelopment. Why we did that, because that was the entry point into property development. Why I say property development, we did some work with the BBC a few years ago where 2/3 of all people looking for a property option in Dhaka can't find it because of those social changes. And if you think about Netflix, Netflix curates its own content. Why? Because it knows what consumers want, and it gives the consumer what it wants versus what is available. And so for us, we don't want to wait 4 or 5 years for someone to satisfy that demand. It allows us now to go and work and build our own property solutions, our own property development. On the fintech side, we provide valuations, and I'm going to show you next what we can do with the data. That valuation allows now us to work with banks, the finance industry, around property valuations and helping them assess their mortgages better. That's becoming increasingly important because Bangladesh as a country has IMF obligations, and so therefore needs to control its default loan rates. So how do you control your default loan rates? You have to be better up front at giving loans to and valuing property in a far better way. We also do property management, and we also provide the mortgage solution, because again, there's no mortgage brokerage there. And coming back to, I think, something that Sean said earlier this morning, which was a lot of these points were enablers. I agree with him. They were enablers, which we've now then turned into monetization products and businesses in their own right. So just touching on one of them is this valuation product. So I think a few people have touched on valuation now, but we've moved this into a monetization product where typically we can charge anywhere between $150 and $250 per valuation report, depending on the complexity of what's required. But that can be used for banks, can be used for individuals, investors, etc. But all of this now is automated from our database because we've collected this information over a long period of time. So we can go in and create a report which is giving property information, property valuation, depending on whether you're wanting to buy the property, rebuild it, or buy to live. There could be different valuations in there based upon obviously the investment that's required. Yield rates, trend rates, what's prospective growth rates. But importantly, the one feature is historical transactions. Because we've been tracking these historical transactions over the last 6 years, we're able to now say to, again, a bank, an individual, etc., this is what your property's worth, and this is the reasons why. We know what's available in the market, but importantly, we're the only ones that actually know what's previously transacted at. And that gives us then that real strong foundation to be able to now leverage and work with these other industries in order to help improve regulation, processes, efficiency on transactions, but also importantly, transparency. And that's it. So it's a very quick summary of Bangladesh, but yeah, thanks.
Mark, thank you for that. Super interesting market, and one that we clearly, from outside in, don't have a lot of transparency into it, and didn't know much about it. Let's start off with the most obvious question here. Average house price, and how did property sell before you arrived?
So average house price is about $80,000 to $100,000. In Dhaka, you can buy property for up to $2 million. And even though people think that this is a country which is, let's say, relatively poor, because of the scarcity of land, that's what's pushed the price up. Properties were sold previously human to human, and if it was done that way, but what it meant was that, let's say, Simon, you were the buyer, you were having to go and manage that entire process yourself. You'd have to understand the legal process, you'd have to go to the registration offices.
Peer-to-peer, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
And what would happen is typically 20-30% down payment was made to the seller prior to transfer. A lot of times that seller just disappears. And that's why we introduced then that escrow model where, okay, we'll hold the money in order to regulate and make that process more transparent.
Yep. What's your market share?
It's still very low. Like I would say 1 to 2% still.
And how would you define market share?
Based on, so we equate that there is about 200,000 transactions in the market, but that's the whole country. Difficult to exactly know how many go on in the markets that we operate, and so I just take 1-2% off of that 200,000.
Okay, that makes sense. Do you cover all the major cities?
Sure. We cover the top 2, but we have data in the next 4, but we haven't launched the sale model yet.
Right. So in the other 4, you're just operating a straight market advertising?
It's pure data. No, it's just pure data collection, so that when we launch in there, we actually have that information and the foundation to be able to transact.
Okay. If Bangladesh is on the cusp of blowing up, and you guys are close to profitability, why did EMPG sell?
Sure. It's very, very clear, I think, if people look at the press, what EMPG strategy is doing. So there are a lot of other factors which wasn't just related to this. I think also, for good things, the move to profitability was actually probably quicker than what would have happened had we stayed in EMPG, because the objectives are slightly different. There's good and bad things with that. So actually, BProperty came out of EMPG actually about 14 months ago. So that move to profitability was largely forced because we came out a lot quicker.
So you didn't have the funding?
Effectively, yeah. Effectively, yeah. And there's pros and cons. There's pros and cons.
Yeah. So then the corollary of this is then why did DCG buy you or merge with you?
You'd have to ask Matt that question. But I think realistically, I think we see the power in DCG actually in bringing together like-minded businesses that are in a market leadership position that actually want to go and change countries and industries. Matt had already sitting on a couple of countries himself, which are actually in a very, very dominant position as well.
Just like this is Cambodia,
Laos, and PNG.
Yep.
These are, let's call them frontier markets, which are probably the next stage further along. Felt that there's actually some strength in being together, sharing of resourcing and sharing of thought process, and that's why we did the deal.
Okay. Did your team have to physically walk the streets to collect the data?
Yep, and they still do. Every day, rain, hail, or shine.
And that's the only way you can get...
It's the only way.
But that's how you then create a defensible position in the market, by actually doing the hard work.
Correct.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because if it was all available electronically, then everyone would get it.
Yep.
Okay. What's the average income in the market?
Income salary-wise?
Yeah.
Or you're talking salary income or revenue for us?
I don't know. I didn't write the question.
Sure. I'll give you both. I'll give you both. So
salary?
It's salary. So a guy that walks the streets, about $200, $250 a month. That's the salesperson earns about $400, $450.
Okay. So if what was the average house price again? 80,000.
80 to 100,000. So yeah.
So your average person struggles to get to a house.
Oh, like those guys, correct. So those guys there are, let's call them, they're from the villages that are moved to the city that then want more of just like a labor job. So they'll never buy these type of houses. But a salesperson, so a salesperson on about $400 to $500 can buy about a $50,000 house. The problem is going back to the property development side, there's no solutions for those guys, right? And so they typically rent. But they can afford the monthly repayments. There's just no property options in the market for them.
Okay. Any plans to expand to Eastern India, where the market's quite fragmented and also looking to go digital?
No.
Okay. That's pretty quick.
Yep.
Okay. Seems like you can do everything the others in other markets can't. Will you start building houses eventually?
Not houses, because there's very few houses in Bangladesh because of the land, but apartments.
Apartments, yeah. I think that's probably what it's leading to, is becoming a developer.
Correct.
In that process.
So we actually we get offered land plots a lot because there's a lack of trust between a landowner and a developer. And in the country, typically it's a JV structure, 50-50 between landowner and the developer. But the problem is the landowner has to wait 4 or 5 years for their return. And we're looking at a model now where we can do largely the same with an 18-month to 2-year build and handover. We've already got the demand, so we know what that market's actually wanting, so we can pre-sell it, fund it.
So how do you solve the problem of turning a 5-year to 10-year development cycle into a 18-month to 2-year?
So my argument is that it's actually just pure inefficiencies in the developer that drives that process.
Okay.
It's not.
It's not government?
No, it's not government.
Okay.
So the approvals on the government are typically 6 to 9 months. It's just then the construction and the efficiencies in the developer.
Okay. If there were no agents in Bangladesh, how did you create them?
So correct training, and it's been painful. I mean, it's really painful. I think again, it was something that Sean said. So there's property developers that had their own sales team, and when we first went there, we went and got the property developer sales teams. But what we learned over about a 12, 18 months period is they are very, very poor at what they do. So we ended up getting university kids first job and then training them. And it has been a longer journey, but I think it's just been the right one to have to work through from
Are
our
these
side.
commission-only sales guys?
No,
So,
salary plus.
okay, what would be the rough split for a good performing, average
So
performing?
ideally, a good performing person should double their salary in comms every month.
Okay.
But typically a local, because of cost of living, they want that security of a salary every month.
Yeah, especially if you're operating in Dakar where there's no
Correct.
accommodation, they've got to live.
100%. And the other issue we had was because the transaction value is typically $5,000 and the salary level was low, that creates an environment for leakage, right? Because effectively, one sale is 12 months salary. So we almost had to go salary. There's your security, and then go aggressive on comms in order to protect away from leakage.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much.
No problem.
Super interesting in this market.
Thanks, mate. Cheers.
Excellent.